most of you were here when we did 19th century. If you were not, don't worry about it. I'm going to, anything that's really relevant that you need to know, I'm bringing it back in and I'm reminding you of this and that and whatever. So never worry about what you've had before. You can just jump in and join at any time. But what we're doing is we're kind of continuing with this definition of modernism. And what we did last fall was look at the birth of modernism in the 19th century, which is really where it's born. And I'll remind everybody about what we talked about at that time. Move that down there. See if we can get this to actually run. Okay. Whoops, that's not what I wanted though. One more, that's what I wanted. And that's going to disappear hopefully in a minute. There we go. So what we did was we looked at the birth of modern art and talked about the changes that identified what was now, quote, modern, or what people believed at that time was modern. So that's what we'll talk about a bit today. There are some dramatic changes that happened in the 20th century as opposed to the 19th. The mere shift of a century had an impact on people. It always does. You know, the minute you start writing 1900 as opposed to 1899, you feel like you've moved into a new era or something different. And it did have a profound effect on people when the date, sort of rolled over like that. One of the things we didn't talk too much about, but we did a little bit at the end, is this idea of the function of art, because that's what's going to change more than anything. The change has already begun, and we'll see what the reasons for that are. Basically, these hold true anytime, any place, anywhere. Art is either what we call art for society's sake, and that's basically traditional art. It usually, traditionally validated the dominant culture, those in power. All art pre-modern was for society's sake, whether it validated a religious point of view or the power of the king or something like that. Art was about power, and its principal role, since they're the ones that paid for it, was the validation of the power structure. Art prior to the modern world was I'm going to say, never challenging power. That's a modern role for art. It was about validating and reinforcing those in power, those with money, those who paid for the art. The second type, art for the artist's sake, now that's a new idea. That begins in the 19th century, and that's when, and we'll talk about why, artists began expressing their own personal point of view. That had never been done before the modern world, at least not overtly or obviously. I'm not going to say someone didn't slip something in here and there, because I can think of examples where they did, but people weren't used to that, and so people didn't recognize what was happening. Artists got away with a little bit because people didn't really recognize that type of art. And then the third, art for art's sake, this can be defined in a lot of different ways. We talked a little bit about it in the late 19th century, but it's going to become more important in the 20th, in modern period, and especially in the postmodern world, which we're really not going to be talking about in this class, but it's art that starts talking about art. What should art be? What's the nature of art? Well, I think it's this. Well, I think it's that. Only the conversation is happening visually as opposed to writing an essay. And we'll talk about that when it gets here. So why these different things, and why did these changes take place? Okay. The biggest social change that takes place in the 19th century is something that came out of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment of the 18th century triggered new ways of thinking and new questioning. I know Kendall talks about the Enlightenment a lot. The Enlightenment simply made people question everything. Industrialism was hugely important. It changed everything in our world, because what industrialism did was it gave rise in the West to a middle class. That's really where the middle class comes from in the Western world. I say that because it's not the only way a middle class can be created. In Japan, for example, it happens in a different way. But in the West, it's industrialism that creates this broad new middle class. And we talked a lot about this when we were covering 19th century. And what this does is this, first then the middle class gets bigger, and with the Enlightenment making them questioning things, it led to revolutions. I mean, the French Revolution is sort of the first, American Revolution is another, but there were revolutions in the 19th century, late 18th and 19th century, that changed things and began putting the middle class in power. It really marked the death of the aristocracy, the death of an elite rich ruling class. Now, I'm not saying they don't still exist, but they are a minority. They are not the big power dominant force that they used to be. It seems like it sometimes, but it's really not the case. We have a massive middle class. And that changes the nature of art, because that system, what we call the patronage system, where really wealthy people went to artists and told them what to do, no longer exists. So you've got artists out there now by the mid 19th century. What am I supposed to do? People aren't coming and telling me what to do. I guess I can do what I want to do. So what do I want to do? I never thought about it before. So that's the sort of dialogue and changes that are happening in the 19th century. And we saw romanticism and realism and movements that challenged the political structure, that challenged capitalism. It's a very political century. And that changed everything. And certainly that's not going away. We're still in that world where artists have choices and they're having to ask questions. We saw that the 19th century was really dominated, at least the latter part of it, by 2 points of view about art. When we ended, we were still at that point where you had two groups of people. You had one group that were the realists who believed one thing about what art should be, and another group, loosely referred to as the symbolists, who believe differently. The realists believe art should be the world I live in, what's around me, what I see. I should be telling the stories of this world. And it started politically. You know, they were very political at first. I need to show you what the poor working class are going through. I'm going to paint them. I'm going to make a picture of them. Totally new concept. The symbolists, on the other hand, after the dominance of realist movement for like 30 years, came back and said, no, art shouldn't be about that. It should be about the imagination. It should come from the mind of the artist. Realism is just very common and ordinary. We don't want to see that. You know, invent things. Tell me how you feel about things, whatever. And these are inherently two different approaches to art. And in the late 19th century, they were very much in conflict. And that's sort of where the century ended. But all of that is going to change dramatically. So as we look at the 20th century, modernism is going to change, and we're going to see the development happening. We really, for this class, we divided into three parts. We've got before World War I, those first few years, and they are very much a continuation, development of what was happening at the end of the 19th century. The big changes take place between the wars, the interwar period, which is basically the 20s and the 30s. That's the period known as high modernism. That's when modernism finds its fullest expression, and we'll talk about that. And then we've got the post-war period, meaning post-World War II, which is the late 40s and the 50s, and that's when modernism comes to America and changes dramatically. Yeah.
Now, all of these changes you're talking about was, even though there were other places, was the intellectual center kind of in France or Europe?
Yes, Paris.
And then it shifted.
Paris remained. Paris had been the center of the Western art world since the 18th century. And it's, it was in the Renaissance, it's in Italy, right? That's the center in Italy. But in the 17th century, it begins to shift as the French kings became really powerful. Louis the 14th, Louis the 15th. We're getting into that period. And they're bringing all the artists to Paris to build them palaces and the like. So the center shifts to Paris, and it stays there until World War II, when the Nazis overran Europe during the war. Artists just fled west. During the war, New York was full of European artists, and they brought modernism to New York, and we'll look at exactly that. That's when it shifts to New York. And New York stays the center of the Western art world until the postmodern world is born. Begins changing in the 70s and 80s. By the 90s, and definitely by 2000, there is no such thing as the center of the art world anywhere. It's everywhere, every country, every major city. And I'm not even talking about the West. There's almost no such thing as a Western art and an Eastern art anymore. It's international and it's everywhere. So all of that changes. But for our purposes, it's mostly Paris, but there are other important centers we're going to look at as well. So this is what we're looking at. Also, this comment on modernism is framed as a heroic quest for truth, simplicity, and honesty. That's going to come up. So we'll talk about that as we see it. They start refining modernism. The biggest change between modernism in the late 19th and modernism in the 20th is the focus of artists and those defining modernism. In the 19th century, this idea of realist versus symbolist, we're really talking about the same thing. They're talking about subject matter. They're talking about what should I depict? What should I present? They're not talking about how should I present it. They're not talking about style, color, or line, or whatever. They're not talking about form at all. They're purely talking about the subject that should be depicted. When we get into the 20th century, that whole argument completely disappears. And we're going to see it today with the very first artist. That whole debate is gone. And the debate is gone because nobody cares about subject matter anymore. It becomes about form. It becomes about how do I do it? How do I use form? Form meaning colors, lines, shape. What should it look like? You can depict anything. I don't care whether you depict a tree outside or a dream you had last night. That's not relevant in the early 20th century. They're all perfectly good subjects. I'm not going to argue with you about that. What I'm going to argue is you should depict it this way. You should use these forms and these colors and these shapes, because that's what really communicates. We're talking about a shift in the awareness of what we call the power of form, the ability of form to communicate. How colors communicate, how shapes and lines communicate. Artists have always known those were important. I mean, we all know that. It's intuitive, right? Red is hot and passionate, and sharp, jagged lines create a certain mood, as opposed to, soft, swelling, liquid forms. That's a different mood and a different emotion. We all know that, but that now becomes what really matters, is how you use those. So the argument's going to change entirely. The first real movement of the 20th century is a very short-lived movement that really comes out of three people. It's called the Fauve movement. It's short-lived. I said 1904 to 1910. That's roughly, I think it's a little early, probably 1905 would be a bit more accurate. And it's in decline by 1908. I mean, it's short-lived. We're talking 4 years. Remember how we talked so much in the 19th century about how fast change was happening and how it was speeding up. Things were, well, talk about speeding up. We're talking about a movement here that gets 4 years before it's, now that's rare. That's really very unusual, only 4 years. And that's because it gets replaced by something far more significant, but we'll get there. Tenets or concepts of Fauvism are concepts that are going to be running through all of 20th century modernism. Number one, color. Color is going to be important. Color as independent. What do we mean by that? Color as a powerful tool to express ideas above and beyond what it might describe. Let's say I paint a red barn. That could communicate in two ways. It could have meaning to you because it's a barn, and therefore maybe it's a farm, and maybe you have associations with farms and barns. And so the idea of a barn has meaning, but so does the idea of red has meaning. Red, as we said, was powerful and emotional and has associations. So color can be independent of describing anything. I can just make a red blob and it's going to have emotion. Just pure color. Now that's an interesting idea. How do I test that hypothesis? The other thing you should keep in mind when thinking about 20th century modernism is this is about experimentation. It's not about fine art. It's not about, I'm going to make a painting that's beautiful and you're going to buy it and hang it in your hall. No, I don't even think about if I'm going to sell it. That's a totally different thing. It's an experiment. It's like a scientist. I'm going to experiment with this. How does this create emotion? Let me make another one here and see, well, how do those two relate in terms of, the emotion or the content or how they communicate? They're experiments. Each work is just an experiment. Flatness and pictorial space. This also started in the late 19th century. We talked about Cezanne and how he played with flat space, how he was the first to recognize and think about the idea that canvases are flat space. It's not a window. No, the Renaissance said it's a window. You're looking into another space. Well, no, it's not. I can reach out and touch it. It's flat. So Cezanne was experimenting with this idea of the two-dimensional space. Maybe that's a reality I shouldn't ignore. Maybe I shouldn't be lying to everybody and telling them there's depth here when in fact there's not. We call that pictorial space. Pictorial space is a construct of the human mind. It's not a real thing. Two dimensions is not a real thing. 2 dimensions doesn't exist. 2 dimensions is a concept. There's no such thing in our world as 2 dimensions, but I can think about the idea of 2 dimensions. I can pretend like that screen is 2-dimensional when it's actually just very thin, but it's 3-dimensional. There are molecules making it up, and they're by definition 3-dimensional. So maybe this imaginary 2-dimensional space has its own existence. Maybe it's really just as real. We call it pictorial space. How do I speak in this language of flatness? So this is going to come up. And then individual emotional response. This is not new either. This came up in the 19th century, but we're going to talk about that. So for some movements, it's more important than others. André Derain, Maurice Vlaminck, and Henri Matisse, who most people have heard of. Matisse is the most famous of the artists, and he will go on to have a much longer career. This is just a short period in his work. The 2 biggest influences on the Fauves are the post-impressionists, and we talked about them before, reminding you of Gauguin and Van Gogh, both of whom were realists. Well, Gauguin sometimes was and sometimes wasn't, but Van Gogh always was a realist. He couldn't work unless he was standing in front of something looking at it. Now he's going to interpret it in a very personal way, but he's still depicting exactly where he is and what he's looking at. And he couldn't work any other way. He couldn't make things up or whatever. That just wasn't him. And both of these stylistically are going to affect the Fauves. For Van Gogh, it's that kind of energetic line, that form. He's very good at understanding form and how it communicates meaning. The wavy line, it's sort of intense. Everything he did was intense and emotional, and the colors and particularly the lines suggest that. Gauguin worked in a different way, less about line and more about color shapes, but he worked with these big pools of color, sort of flat pools of color. I hesitate to touch this thing because at one point there was a little arrow I could get out of that, but I'm afraid to touch it now because I don't want to screw anything up. But pools of color, those pools of there, you can do that. Like shapes like this big flat orange, this big blue, which is very flat. Each of these pools is very flat in its own right. It's not trying to create illusion here. So very flat.
It's kind of interesting, those 2 paintings are kind of the same thing.
Yeah, they're very interesting, aren't they? Two couldn't be more different in some ways, and yet, they're both landscapes with water scene and
Yeah, I mean, the screen is going the same way, it's heavy on the right, and it looks like there's a castle or something in the background of each one of them. First and main walk.
wow, yeah, I didn't even notice that, but you're right. Even the details are very similar, but it's two different people working at the same time from, two different temperaments, two different points of view about the nature of art. Now, what is Durain going to do? This is Durain from
Peggy, can I ask a question about
Sure.
those two?
Yes.
They are, maybe it's just the translation into what we can see on screen, but neither of them has the boldness of color that I associate with either one of the, I mean, I know Van Gogh changed his color over time a bit, but still,
Well,
they don't have the boldness of color. They're more pleasant, so to speak, than
Well, you
I
may
would
not-
say the other things by these two people that I'm familiar with.
Well, you may not be seeing the same thing I'm seeing then, because the Gauguin is very bold color. It's very bright oranges and blues and greens, quite intense.
Well, maybe because I don't like red and I don't see any red in it.
Well, there's a big red bush on the right.
Okay, well, it's probably just the translation to the
It may
screen
just be your
twice
screen.
over.
But and the Van Gogh is pretty intense, but not as intense as many of his works. So you're right on that. There's some pretty powerful blues, and it's his favorite colors. His favorite colors are those blues and yellows.
And this isn't, these aren't at the Nelson, right?
No, no. But I want to get back into the 20th. Now we see, speaking of bold colors, someone who's taken that and is now borrowing from both. You can see the sort of energy, the energetic line and mark making of Van Gogh, but in the mountains and the sky, you see those pools, flat pools of color from Gauguin. He's really just picking up from both of them. Now, what this is really about is not landscape, it's about color. He's trying to understand how colors and shapes create meaning. How do we take emotion from pure colors? The group had met as early as 1901, the three of them, but Durain had to go into military service for like 3.5 years. And so they didn't get back together again until 1905. And that's when the three of them started painting together and talking about these ideas and what they were trying to do. Durain is sort of in the middle of the group. They first showed together in I think it was the autumn salon of 1905, the autumn salon. Last fall, we talked about the salons, the official salon. And then we saw that it was in 1884, artists created their own so they could be independent. And they created the so-called independent exhibition, which held a salon or just an exhibition every spring. And that was really important for artists who weren't being accepted by sort of the traditional mainstream. But in 1903, a second salon was created. It's called the Autumn Salon. It's the Salon d'Automne in Paris, and it was held in the fall. And it was another venue for avant-garde artists, one where you could show your work. So from this point on, you had the fall and then the spring exhibition. So there were 2 times a year artists had opportunities. And in the fall of 2005 was the first year that the Fauves all exhibited together, that there was a space where you had like a number of works by all three of these people together. So it was the first time people recognized them as a group. And one critic who was writing about that made a comment, the room had little sculptures in it as well, not theirs, but other people's. And when he went into the room, he was speaking about this little sculpture, and he said, well, it looks like we have a Donatello among the wild beasts. And Donatello was a Renaissance sculptor, so it's just, he said, well, here's a nice little sculpture, and then these wild beasts around him. And fauve means wild beast. So that's where the name comes from, and the name just stuck. Now, these were pretty wild in some people's minds. It doesn't look particularly wild beast to me. I don't think it's significantly different from Gauguin and Van Gogh to be given that title, but people just weren't used to it. And it's nothing like what we're going to see happening elsewhere. He went in 1906 to London on a commission and created this work of Westminster Bridge. And it's a pretty good example of what we see the Fauves doing that is different from Gauguin and Van Gogh. And that is, they're finally letting go of what we call local color. Local color is basically the color that a thing is. I mean, if grass is green, you paint it green. Maybe like Van Gogh always used local color. He didn't like make something orange that was really purple. He may take that orange and push it as far as he can so that it's something, you know, really, it's not natural color, but he's still connected to local color. So was Gauguin most of the time, but not always. But these artists, oh, it's the 20th century now. They don't feel that they need to be limited to local color. If I want to make the grass red, I'll make the grass red. If I want the tree to be purple, I'll make the tree purple. So that's a small step, but it's an important step in looking at and experimenting with color. Vlaminck, I just want to look briefly at him. Vlaminck's work is the wildest. You know, if the three are on a continuum, Derain is kind of in the middle, and Vlaminck is way over on the expressive side. And one reason for that is he's not purely French. His father was Flemish. They also were, his parents were kind of bohemians. He was raised by a bunch of bohemians, and they collected like African sculpture, and they were, you know, like the sort of early 20th century version of hippies in Paris, you know, it's like, so he grew up in a different environment, and he was like really free to sort of go farther. He's the most influenced by Van Gogh, because of course, of all the post-impressionists, Van Gogh was the most expressive, the most emotional. And, you know, it's an easy comparison to something like Van Gogh's Red Vineyards, which we looked at before, where you have these very intense colors. You know, Vlaminck is giving us something flatter, something a little farther removed from local color. You know, he's taking it a step further. But the person I really want to get to is Matisse, because he is the best known of the artists of the Fauve movement. And Fauvism is just his early work. Matisse had a number of mentors who were important. Matisse has much wider influences, a much broader interest in art, and he's going to have a much, much longer career. He's going to be an important artist for most of the 20th century. One of his mentors was a symbolist. Now, both Derain and Vlaminck were primarily influenced by the realists. They're depicting landscapes and things outside, but Matisse is going to bring the symbolists into it. Now, if you remember the symbolists, they're the artists who believed art should come from the imagination. It should be expressing not specific things, but it should be sort of suggestive, moody, without being specific. Moreau is one of the founders of the symbolist movement. We looked at this work called The Apparition, which is a vague title. It's clearly related to his images of Salome and John the Baptist. So that's really what it's meant to be depicting. But he's given it mystery by calling it the apparition. He's giving it mystery by having this head floating in the sky with light coming off of it. The symbolists were poetic. I mean, their idea was to use images to evoke moods and feelings without telling specific stories. They wanted to keep it general. And that idea is one that Moreau communicated, and Matisse absorbed that. So Matisse does not purely work in realist subjects. He's very influenced by the symbolist. His second mentor was a realist, one of the most important of the post-impressionists, Camille Pissarro, who was also the mentor to Cézanne and Gauguin, even Van Gogh a little bit, Seurat. He was a very important person in mentoring others. And this is Pissarro's Red Roof. If you remember, Pissarro was the one who was an anarchist, that movement, and so works like these have political associations to them. Now this is an early Matisse. This is during the period when Derain is away. So this technically, this is not Fauvism. This is just a painting of a woman. He had a model and he painted her. His work is never really just about color, but it does have a really strong sense of design. Now, really look at it. The whole thing is a study in contrast. You have all these wonderful geometric rectangular shapes everywhere. Everywhere is flat shape against flat shape. Here, here, here. And then right in the middle, set off against that, is this curvilinear form of the female body. It's a wonderful study in contrast. Everything supporting her is geometric and sort of abstractly arranged, and then she is in the middle. It's really a powerful design. You know, when people look at paintings, they don't often look at form. Most people would look at this and never see anything except that it's a woman in this room. But when you look at the composition, she's placed very centrally, right in the center, and she's facing directly out at you. And we know that's rare in art. That's extremely rare. That alone is a strong design. People in paintings aren't supposed to know they're being looked at. But she's a model and she knows it. And then around her, sort of swirling around her in this radial fashion, are these wonderful sort of squares and rectangles that pop up and sort of spin around and frame her. It's very calculated as a design, and Matisse is very interested in pattern. He's creating beautiful patterns here, and that's something that will continue through his work. Now, in the early part of the century, one group of 19th century artists had a really strong impact on everyone, and they were the pointillists. Remember them? We looked at the pointillists, Seurat and his very famous Le Grand Jat, and then Signac. Now, as the new century begins, Seurat is dead. He died in 1891. But Signac, who we don't think of as being as important, was actually more important at the time because he was still alive. He was in his 40s and he was a major figure in Paris. In fact, at the turn of the century, Paris is kind of an interesting place. Van Gogh is dead, Seurat is dead, Gauguin is going to die in 1903. So, and he's not here anyway. He's out in the Marquesas Islands, you know, dying of syphilis. Cézanne is still alive. He dies in 1906, but he's not in Paris either. He's down in the Riviera in the south of France, painting his mountains. So who's in Paris? Of the big 19th century voices, the only one in Paris is Signac. And so his influence is going to be much stronger for a little while than anyone else's. As soon as Gauguin dies, retrospective exhibition, his influence is felt. As soon as Cézanne dies, 1906, retrospective exhibition, his influence is going to be felt. But until that happens, Signac. And interestingly, in this period of 1904, 1905, it's known as the season of the pointillists. All the young artists start doing pointillism. I mean, that's how influence works. You know, there's a big artist and he's there and he's been doing that for 20 years, let's try that. So Matisse goes through his phase. Everybody did who was in Paris. In fact, in the summer of 1905, Seurat was very successful and quite wealthy, not Seurat, Signac was very successful by this time, and he had a villa down in Saint-Tropez, and every summer he would take a group of young artists and they go down, they get to spend the summer with him. I mean, you know, if you could imagine you're a young artist and some very important person invites you down, I mean, that you want to be in that group that gets invited. So Matisse was in that group, so spent the whole summer indoctrinated by pointillism. So it's not shocking that you see him making something like this. And it's very much a symbolist subject. Lux comme et volupté, which is a reference to the subject in a very general way, luxury, calm, and voluptuousness. It's not meant to be real so much as it's almost poetic. This is sort of walking the line between realism and symbolism.
It looks like a copy of Manet's picnic.
It may very well be related. I mean, it doesn't look like Manet's picnic. The style is entirely different. It has, they're having a picnic. I mean, that's, you got nude figures. I don't know who that looks like another woman. I'm not sure who that one clothed figure is. There are hundreds of paintings like this. Cézanne did, the idea of nude bathers was a very ubiquitous scene in 19th century art. We just didn't look at a lot of them. It's more likely based on Cézanne's bathers, which is more abstract, which is, yeah, yeah. Manet did one, and Manet was riffing off all of the, his were picnics, his weren't bathers. It was a picnic in a park. There wasn't really a river or a lake. There was a little stream in the back because one of the women was sort of washing. Yeah, it is part of a tradition. In fact, it's tapping into a very old tradition that goes even back to classical art, Greco-Roman art, where this was a theme of like the Graces bathing and Diana bathing. And it's almost, classical in that connection. And he was quite aware of that. But it's his little pointillist jaunt. And this is Signac. It's kind of hard to see, but that's sort of pointillist as well. But notice the sort of swirling lines in the Signac, that's very symbolist. He was at a point also where he's bouncing back and forth between realism and symbolist. He was verbally a realist, but that's a pure symbolist painting. But this is where we really get to Matisse's contributions more than anything else. Now, Derain is back finally from the war, and now all three of them are working together. So they're starting to influence one another. And this is quite different, the open window. You still see, as we saw in the Derain, the combination of sort of the small energetic brushwork of a Van Gogh and the large sort of pools of color of a Gauguin. However, Matisse is doing some interesting examination of color here that Derain was not doing. In fact, what he's doing is looking very much at the relationships of color and how they relate to one another on the canvas. And I'll show you another work from the same year. Both of these are from 1905, where we have the open window and the green stripe, and that's his wife, portrait of his wife. Yes.
What size? Can't you turn it off?
It's not hers. It's not the same ringtone. Is anybody else ringing?
Maybe I am. That's not my phone sound.
Well, whatever. It stops.
What size?
I do not have the dimensions on these. I guarantee the green stripe is small. I mean, that's going to be no more than life size.
Generally painted on an easel, kind of.
Yeah.
So it had to fit on an easel. It wasn't a big.
Well, those big ones fit on easels. We're going to see some 6x8. I mean, he paints big. He does paint big, but these aren't them. The Fauve paintings tend not to be too big. What we see him doing here in color is examining the relationship between warm and cool colors. And he's doing the same thing in both paintings. In both paintings, there's a background and foreground. And in each one, he's playing off warm and cool. Let me clarify that. In the window, for example, on the right, get off my screen. On the right side, you have a warm color. This is warm. And then over here, we have a cool color. And then over here, we have a cool color and a warm color. You can see it better in the green stripe. Background, cool color, warm color. But face reverses that. This one, we have cool color on this side and warm color on this side, with the green stripe down the middle being the border where warm and cool meet. So that's why he's titling this The Green Stripe and not Portrait of Madame Matisse, because there's nothing to do with Madame Matisse. She's a face. She could just as easily be a door or a chair or whatever. Now, when I said subject didn't matter, this is what I mean. if you're examining color, it doesn't matter what you're using to examine color. If you're examining shape, it doesn't matter what it is. This is purely a formal study. However, it is early, it's still 1905. And so it's still going to have a subject. They're not at the point yet where they're going to really completely get rid of the subject. That will happen, but it's too early for that. So he's got to use something. So he uses his wife and he uses a door. But it doesn't matter because it's not really about either one of those. It's about the colors. Now, the symbolist influence gets much stronger after this, and this is one of his most interesting works. Now, this is big, 6 foot by 8 foot. He showed it in the Independence exhibition of that year, and it's a very good example of how he's influenced by this. Now, the subject matter does matter here. The subject does matter on this because it's a symbolist subject. It's an escapist subject. It's joie de vivre, joy of life. It's a major project that he undertook, and it's a popular theme in symbolist art, and I'll come back to that. You know, he was doing a similar subject. We've got nudes. We don't really have I guess you could read that as a lake in the background, but these are really quite different in many, stylistically, obviously, but also in tone. He's influenced by symbolist ideals. And this painting on the right is a good example of those symbolist ideals. It's a painting from 1891 titled The Dawn of a Dream. And it's actually, or Les Fleurs du Mal is the subtitle. And Les Fleurs du Mal is the title of a poem, a long poem by Charles Baudelaire, the symbolist poet. And it's a reference to that. And so we have a figure here. We're meant to read this not as realism, but as this guy, Baudelaire, the poet, who's thinking about his poem. And then this is just the vision around him. This is imagining Les Fleurs du Mal, or the flowers of evil, which the poem is about, which has to do with sexuality and women and all that. So it's an evocative subject, the opposite of realism. And it's very influential on Matisse. Now look at the forms and the shapes. Instead of, we saw him using geometric forms and shapes. Now it's all curvilinear, making it dreamlike. It's very fluid. You know, the shapes are fluid, as if they're, you know, merging and melting, and even the space, the color is totally non-local, totally imaginary. Nudity is an interesting thing in art. It can mean so many different things at different times. One of the things we talked about when we can go back to ancient Greece, but we talked about how through much of the history of Western art, nudity symbolized heroism. It was mostly the male figure. You had the heroic male, which goes back to the ancient Greek world. We start seeing that changing in the 19th century, where for some people it starts to symbolize vulnerability, without clothes. We saw that in Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, where you had all those nude figures that were like practically corpses, and the nudity made them seem more vulnerable. There's also sexuality that can be associated with it. This for the symbolists, and there's no question in Morin's painting, that's what it symbolized. Yeah.
Maybe it's because I'm left-handed, but it's warmer in Greece, so they have to wear less clothes, and it's colder in France, and they went to Europe. Is that happening?
No, no. Nice associations, but it comes in Greece. In Greece, it comes from the fact that athletic competitions were practiced in the nude, and athletes were seen as heroic. So nude athletes were where the idea of heroism comes from. So that's the reason in Greece, not because it's warmer. It get pretty cold up in the mountains in Greece. So nice try. But certainly sort of an overt sexuality was something the symbolists were obsessed with. Remember all those femme fatales and symbolist art, and those dangerous women seducing men and all that was a popular subject. That's in the one on the right. But that's not what Matisse is giving us. He's tapping into another association, which is the idea of something almost innocent, almost Garden of Eden, something primal and innocent. You know, man in the state of nature. It's absolutely a Garden of Eden reference. I don't mean this is meant to depict the Garden of Eden, but it's the idea of the pure innocence. You know, it's like, remember when images of nude babies on bearskin rugs used to be an okay thing to have? I mean, everybody had nude pictures of their babies. They didn't sexualize it. You know, they thought it was a symbol of purity, and, you know, then later generations sort of sexualized everything. And now, you know, you're a pervert if you have something like that, which is a very different concept. But this is more harking back to that purity of the nude, and it really is almost an idyllic world. It's sort of like a paradise that it's moved into, and that's certainly what he's sort of depicting here. Now, notice this little group in the middle of these dancers. That's going to actually lead him to his next big work, which is called The Dance, which is another big, you know, 8.5 by 12 foot painting. It's currently in the Museum of Modern Art. Now, this is going a long way from this is not Fauvism. This is much more minimal. The color is too minimal. There's basically 4 colors here. That's it. This is a period where he's giving us a kind of simple monumentality. Now, I always think of this reminds me of Stonehenge, because Stonehenge to me is simple monumentality. They're just big stones, but they're monumental. I mean, you don't have to have a million little things to communicate a big idea. You can have something profound, simple. It's like, I don't have to scream to make a point. I can whisper to make a point, and everyone will come and listen to what I'm saying. And that's sort of what he's doing here with these very, very simple forms. It's clearly symbolist inspired. Again, it's sort of primal in a very simple way. It can be, is it a sort of analogy of it's analogy of dance as a symbol of life. Well, boy, we've seen that before. We've seen several paintings in the 19th century where dance was used as a metaphor for life. You know, the dance of life. We saw it in Munch, and we saw it in several symbolists, actually, and that's where it's coming from. What's interesting about this painting, in addition to its, you know, simplicity, it's almost childlike simplicity, and I'm going to talk more about that childlike idea in a minute when we get to the expressionists. But in addition to that childlike simplicity of form is its sort of primitiveness, and we'll talk about primitive. Everyone's talking about primitive in the early 20th century. Everything primitive is good, and what they basically meant by primitive was anything other than Western art. So, you know, African art, art from Oceania, art from Asia, art from anywhere, including children's art. And we're going to talk about that. They were looking at a lot of children's art too. And the reason for that is they're beginning this search for this thing called creativity. Like, what is creativity? All they knew is that Western art up to that point didn't have it. So where do I find it? And they're mostly talking about academic art. They're looking at academic art, the stuff turned out by the academy, which, you know, hasn't been important for a long time, but they see it as not really very creative. It's formulaic, you follow formulas and you do this and that. So how do I tap into creativity? And we'll talk more about that, where people see it comes from. Ooh. While the dance was on exhibit at the exhibition, one person saw it, a man named Sergei Shukin. Shukin is a very important figure in the art world. He is a Russian collector, and he goes back and forth between Moscow and Paris, and he's a huge collector. He had a huge collection of impressionist, post-impressionist. He knows everything that's going on, and he's very, very responsible for bringing a lot of this art to Moscow, and he's going to affect the history of Russian art because it's through Shukin and others like him. Most of Shukin's collection ended up, it's really the basis of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Is really the collection of Sergei Shukin. So he's very important. Well, he saw that painting by Matisse, and he said, I really like that painting, but I want it in a different color. Can you imagine having the nerve to tell an artist, I like that, but it looks like it's a car, you know, I want it in blue, you know, I don't. So Matisse took the commission. He says, okay, I'll paint you one. And so the one on the right is the one he painted for Shukin. But Shukin wanted two paintings. He also commissioned a second painting to go with it. So the one on the left is the one in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. One at the right is on the right is in the Hermitage, but it's with the second one called Music. So he did a second painting, same size, now with 5 male figures called Music. So actually, I think it was a really good commission because it gives more meaning to both of them. Now you've got a context. Now I can see female figures, music. Now I can see them as muses if I want to, because we've now got a second art form of music. The thing is, after he commissioned them, he changed his mind after Matisse had painted them and said, I don't like these. I don't want these. And Matisse got really mad at that point. Shukin went back to Moscow, and then he changed his mind again and got back in touch with Matisse and said, no, on second thought, I'll take them. So they did make their way to Moscow. Okay, so something is going to happen between 1907, 8, 9, 10, 12 that's going to affect everyone and end Fauvism, and that is Cubism, which we'll talk about next time. But by this point, certainly by 1910, everyone's starting to be affected by it. And you see it very much in this Matisse, where we see angularity, forms broken apart, opened up. We'll talk about that later. But what I find most interesting is what is not Cubist, but was really still Matisse coming in, and that is this ornate decoration here. Matisse is always interested in patterns, what he's drawn to. And he's really continuing a tradition from Gauguin. Gauguin was interested in fabric designs, tapestries, pattern, decorative forms. Matisse really picks up from him. There's a line going through that's going to affect a lot of later artists in the 70s and 80s. But the piano lesson is clearly taking him into this more geometric realm. Now, what happens to the others after 1910? Well, here's Derain in 1905, and here's Derain in 1912. Clearly, he's been affected, but in a bizarrely uncolorful way. He's fighting to remove color, and we'll talk next time about why the Cubists early on anyway eliminate color from their work. Derain, clearly this is influenced by Cubism now, but he's not going to lose his color. He's going to keep color. This is unusual. If you look at a regular Cubist and this, you'd never confuse them because real Cubism has little or no color in it. This is clearly Vlaminck's version of it. So they all change dramatically. Do you have any questions or anything on Fauvism before we move to Germany and see what's happening there at the same time?
I can just say that I haven't seen a lot of these paintings. They're beautiful.
They are beautiful, aren't they? The color is magnificent. Yeah. Well, these are not, I mean, there are thousands of artists out there. There are hundreds of thousands of artists out there. And most of them aren't known by anybody unless you make a point of studying the subject or looking them up. There are very few people that we really know about. Okay, then I'm going to turn our attention in Germany. That's what was happening in Paris. Now, what's happening in Germany? First of all, for some of you, it's a reminder. For others of you, it may be the first time you've experienced it. But let me tell you right now, German art has been, is now, and probably always will be, the most emotional and expressive of all Western art. There is no Western art that's more expressive than German art. And it's an old, old tradition that goes back to the Middle Ages. And I'll show you some, two of the most famous early pieces of German art that we looked at when we did the Western survey back in 2020. The Vesper Build, one of my all-time favorite sculptures, and the Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece, the Renaissance piece. Now neither of these pieces would have been acceptable anywhere except Germany at the time. You know, the Italians would have had fit if, you know, this is just such a violation of Italian taste, wouldn't have flown in France or Britain or anywhere else, but it's purely German. And what you're seeing, particularly in the Vesper Build, is just pure emotion and intensity, absolute pure emotion, distortion of form to the extreme. And, you know, it's, Picasso often said that, you know, distorting the human form has an impact on the viewer in a way that distorting anything else does not, because we interpret it as sort of violence to the human body. And this is really about the suffering of Christ. It's not about redemption or angels in the sky or anything uplifting. This is pure suffering, and that's what they wanted to communicate. Same is true with the depiction of the crucifixion on the right. Nobody depicted it like that, but the Germans. I mean, you know, there are sores on his body, he's bleeding. It's just intensely painful, but that's the German style. So should we expect something nice and rosy when we get to the 20th century? Probably not. That would be a mistake. Two strongest influences on the German movement of the early century are Van Gogh. Of all of the post-impressionists, he is the most expressive, the most emotional, so he's going to have a greater impact than not Gauguin or Cézanne, the intellectual, or what pointillism. There's no emotion in that. They're going to go right to Van Gogh. So Van Gogh is the greatest influence. And also Munch. Remember, Edvard Munch was a symbolist from Norway. We looked at him last fall, and I mentioned at that time something you probably don't remember. It's that he actually spent several years in Munich. In fact, he was in Munich when he painted the Scream. So he's a Norwegian artist, but his impact on Germany is very strong. And paintings like that, the intensity of this and the way form is used, color, shapes, to communicate that intensity is going to be understood in the 20th century in a way it really wasn't in the late 19th century. So very important person. In fact, Munch was so influential that, I mean, he was there from 92 to 96 in Munich. And when he had a big show, it actually was closed. The officials in charge thought that sort of just went too far. Hard to imagine, knowing German art, how they could think Munch's was too much. But when the show closed, the young German artists who were really drawn to this actually, it led to the Berlin Secession, and the secession movement was in Europe in the 90s, was in many different major cities. And it was basically young artists getting angry, walking out and seceding from the artist group that dominated and just sort of forming their own new group. It's an idea of the 1890s, seceding from those in power. So it really led to the Munich secession. Germany had two secessions, Munich and Berlin. and they form their own group. Okay, so what are the key concepts of expressionism? In Germany, we call it expressionism. It's very similar to Fauvism in terms of what they're trying to do. Look at our points. Color is independent, flatness of pictorial space, individual emotional response. Those are the exact same three things I listed for Fauvism. So why aren't they the same movement? Well, because one is understood by Germans and takes one route, and the other is undertaken by French, who are far less emotional. Germany, unlike Paris, has never had one center. There's no center of the German art world. There never was. There are important art communities in many German cities. There's no equivalence to Paris in Germany. It's not Munich, because there's a center in Dresden, Berlin, Freiburg. I mean, every major city that has a university has this art center. And so that makes their history a little bit different. So we're going to look at two groups. Also, the expressionist movement in Germany is much bigger than the Fauve movement in France, where you just had a few people influencing a few people. This is huge, and it lasts through the whole century right up to today. There's neo-expressionists working in Germany now, and it's still very powerful art. So we're going to look at two groups. One group that was formed in Dresden by some students who came together to form this, and also a group in the Dresden group will move to Berlin and eventually be known as the Berlin group. The Munich group was an even bigger group. That was the biggest group, the Blue Rider, the Blaue Reiter group. And the Blaue Reiter group involved more than visual artists. There were musicians involved and writers. I mean, it really was a big movement that affected more than just the painters. Okay, let's start with the Brücke group, however. The Brücke was 5 or 6 people, but very influential. And we're just going to look at one artist. The Brücke is the bridge. You know, what do they mean by bridge? They meant it in 2 ways. They thought of themselves as a bridge to the past, in other words, German history in art, but also a bridge to the future. So that's where their name comes from, or why they called themselves that. They really saw what they were doing as a sort of heroic quest. Certainly in Germany, it took on that role and became something associated with modern art in general. This is where primitivism really finds its most powerful early voice. What did that mean? As I said, they would use the word primitivism to refer to sort of African art and oceanic art, early medieval woodcuts, and also children's art. In fact, one of the very first exhibitions of the art of children in a major museum was in Dresden in 1904, and they saw that. Why are they drawn to the art of children? Why are they being drawn to African sculpture and oceanic sculpture from the South Pacific? They must see something in that. They must see something important that they're lacking, that they want to understand. First of all, there are a number of basic assumptions associated with this primitivizing or embracing the primitive. One of those assumptions is that there is a source of creativity, that there's something out there where creativity comes from, and that you can tap into that. If you can find it, you can tap into that and be creative. Secondly, that this source is universal, and that it's rooted in simplicity, somehow simplicity, that what was lacking in academic art was lost because of complexity, that somehow if we could simplify and get back to the core, something core, very basic, and therefore simplicity. And that term can be defined in a lot of ways. We're going to see a lot of different, maybe you mean formally simple, or do you mean stylistically simple? I mean, even the word simplicity doesn't have an easy definition. but that you also have to believe that something simpler is somehow truer and therefore more honest. And what they meant by that was sort of uncorrupted. Without a doubt, they saw academic art as corrupt. They're not wrong. If you're going to look at the academies, that's about as corrupt as you could get. These artists are doing nothing but painting for a market. They'll paint anything if somebody will give them money for it. I mean, that's corruption. That's not pure art. That's not someone who's painting something because it matters to them other than their paycheck. So there's a kind of sense of a corruption in the art world that they're looking at. So they see this in primitive art. Now, how do I tap into it? They certainly see it in children. Children become for them the ultimate uncorrupted artist. This is before you get corrupted. You've heard this language before. People talk about it even today. You know, when children, children used to be taught in school, draw it this way, color within the lines. And that's sort of taboo today. It's like, oh, let them be free, let them color outside the lines. These are ideas that are in the air that somehow if you limit them, you're corrupting them. You need to let them tap into their pure, that there's something better about what they make if you don't tell them what to make, right? So that's the idea we're talking about here, sort of uncorrupted. So how do you do that? I mean, it's easy to say that's the source of creativity, but how do I tap into it? Isn't it too late for me? I'm already living in this society. I'm already this person. I can't go back to being a child and tapping into my child mind, nor can I make art purely as an African sculptor would make it, because that's not who I am. So what they sort of hit upon was, well, maybe if I just mimic the forms, maybe if I just make it look like, that's a dead end, of course, because that's not really how you tap into creativity. But, let's try it. What do I know? Fake it till you make it sort of attitude. So a lot of the sort of distortion we're seeing here in this abstracting of form is being directly influenced by things they've seen, like sculptures from non-Western cultures, or the way children would draw something. So that's the source. And the reason is because they're trying to understand creativity. If I just copy this child's drawing over and over again, can I learn how to be creative? Simple answer, no. But, I don't know that yet. So I'm going to keep trying that. Interesting to compare this to a Matisse. I see a strong difference here. They're similar, their goals are similar. They're going to be very similar. But Matisse's is more fluid. It's quieter. Kirchner's is louder, it's more aggressive, and that's because of its angularity. This is a good example of shape and the power of different shapes. Sharp, angular shapes simply create more aggressive forms, as opposed to the more fluid, curvilinear forms that you see here. One of Kirchner's better known works is this one, Street in Berlin. Now, it's an interesting image. Is it a realist work? It says street in Berlin, and there's people walking down the street. So is this realism? It actually is more allegory than reality. This is a very good example of using art history to understand the art. One of the things I always say about art history is about context. This painting is about context, 100%. This is Berlin, 1913. What's happening at this moment? We are on the eve of World War I. Berlin is chaotic. It's tense. This is very much capturing the intensity on the street of Berlin. And he's using kind of sexual tension to create tension in general. Things we wouldn't recognize. These women are prostitutes. We don't recognize that. Anyone in 1913 would recognize that. So they're sort of flirting with this guy who's probably embarrassed and he's trying to look away. So there's sexual tension here that's really strong. It's very much about the corruption of the city. All of these Bruca artists working in Dresden and now in Berlin, they're kind of moralists. They're all very critical of German society, and they see it as corrupt, and there are prostitutes everywhere and criminals everywhere. And their work is very much an indictment of very corrupt German society. So that's playing into this as well. So when he's showing this, he's showing us the corruption on the streets, but it's also paralleling, the politics of the moment. Now, how's he communicating that? This very aggressive handling of form. Look at the marks that he's making. They're slashing marks. This isn't some pretty little mark making. This is someone who's treating his brush like it's a butcher knife, and he's sort of slashing it across the canvas. That kind of aggression comes across. I mean, you see it, at these sort of knife edges of the forms. You feel that emotion that he's feeling with these slashing diagonals. Look at the space. He's compressing the space. He's pushing it all together to create a very uncomfortable space. He's certainly not the first to do that. We've seen artists doing that, throughout the whole history of art. Artists understand how to use space. What can make someone uncomfortable? How do I make you uncomfortable? Well, I'll take these people and I'll crush them into this space. I always call it the crowded elevator space, that elevator opens and it's already packed, and should I get on? Should I not get on? I'm not comfortable in this space. That's the discomfort that he's creating here for you, along with the angularity, even the nature of the colors. Those are odd colors. They're beautiful colors, but they're not your primaries. They're unusual pinks and blues, not what you expect on the sidewalks of a street. So everything about it creates this strong sense of disorientation. It's a psychological disorientation. It's social upheaval. After all, that's what's really happening here, and that's what it's really all about. On the eve of the war within a few months is going to break out, and certainly that was in the air at the time. So it is much more allegory than reality. It's more of an allegory of modern life in a city and how horrible it is. It's almost impossible to not read this in the connection to World War I, even though they didn't know yet that World War I was going to happen. This is before it begins, but wars don't suddenly appear. There's always, when you look back, there's always a building up to it. And you look back and wonder, why couldn't we see that this was happening? So they know something's about to happen. Also, he was very much involved in this revival of printmaking, particularly woodcut. Woodcut as a printmaking medium had pretty much disappeared. Durer used it in the 15th century, but then woodcuts disappeared because they were too crude and coarse and rough looking. From the Renaissance on, artists preferred etching and engraving. These used fine little lines and you could get beautiful detail, but they abandoned woodcut. Woodcut is the style of primitive cultures, and that's what they wanted. So of course there's a revival of woodcut. You can see how coarse it is. The softness of the wood means when you cut into it, you make these big, jagged, more coarse marks. And there's been ever since a new interest in woodcut. This is also a woodcut. Kirchner actually ended up leaving Germany in the 30s. We're going to talk much more about what happens in Germany in the 30s when we get to that period, but preview, Nazis don't like modern art. We'll come to that later. And artists who worked in this style, most German artists were getting really, really nervous by the 30s, and many of them were leaving. He actually went into exile in Switzerland in the late 20s. Of course, the fascists were rising in power in the late 20s, the whole latter half of the 1920s even, and they were sensing it. He really suffered from sort of a mental problem. He went to recuperate a bit and stayed there. I think he was actually fought in World War I and had a breakdown pretty early. And then when he went home, he just imagined soldiers were about to knock knock on his door and drag him away. And he was sort of really scared and paranoid, which was a pretty good thing to be at the time. But after 33, as we will see later, they are forbidden from working in any sort of abstract way like this. So he went to Switzerland, but he actually ended up committing suicide in 1938 in Switzerland. I think he was just tormented from the war, his war experiences. I mean, World War I is hell. We'll talk about World War I later, but it didn't leave anybody in very good shape. It had a much more traumatic effect than World War II did on most people, obviously not everybody. But the person I'd like to talk about now is the most important of the artists working as part of the German Expressionist movement. And he's not even German. In fact, the most important thing to know about Wassily Kandinsky is that he's Russian, but he's in Munich, and he's one of the leaders of the Blaureiter movement. And he's one of the 5 most important artists of the 20th century. Certainly the most important artist we've talked about thus far. Of course, we haven't talked about that many, but Kandinsky is a major player in the entire century, and we'll come back and see some of his later work later. Kandinsky arrived in Germany in 1896 from Russia. He declined a professorship in law. He's very well educated. We're going to see, and in the 19th century, there were a number of artists who were educated in law, studied law. But it's important to understand when we talk about someone who studied law, we don't mean they went to law school in the way people study law today. Studying law in the 19th century and early 20th was really, a closer analogy would be business school. That's, you wonder when you read about these people in the 19th century, why are there so many people studying law? Well, they're not, they're studying business. And that was a very common educational path for those who could afford it, of a certain class. You studied sort of business, but they called it studying law. So I'm just throwing that out. They weren't all lawyers at all. They were just, it's a generic education for someone who's going to go out and run a business of some kind, but that's not what he ever did. He was also a very good musician. He could have been a professional violinist, and music plays a big part in all of his art. We're going to talk about a number of things relating to Kandinsky. First of all, I want to talk about the fact that he's Russian, because that is going to flavor everything. Now, later, when we come to the interwar period, we'll talk about Russian art more and the modern artists working in Russia. And this will be true of them as well. But all Russian art has its own history, its own tradition, and it's nothing like the rest of Western Europe. In fact, given what's happening today, everyone should look at Russian history, because what's happening today will make a lot more sense if you understand Russian history. Russia at the beginning of the 20th century was very much a rural agrarian society, not that advanced from the Middle Ages, where the rest of the Western world had been undergoing a gradual industrialism and modernizing. Russia had not. There was no industrial revolution in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, one reason for the revolution, which we will talk about later, was that the Bolsheviks promised industrialism. They promised to bring people, into the modern world so they could compete. The czars wanted to keep it a rural serfdom. They were perfectly happy with that, but the people weren't. What that means is their art traditions are entirely different. There's no gradual 19th century of building toward modernism. It's like one day you're in the medieval world, and the next day you wake up and you're the cutting edge modernism. They leapt over like 300 years of history in art, and also in culture, in politics, and it's why they're still screwed up. And it's China's problem too. China has the same kind of history where instead of gradual change, it's no change, no change, no change, big change. And you can't do that. It's going to give you a couple hundred years of instability. And they're still on their first 100. You know, there's going to be a while before either of those places are stable. And I think it's moving faster and faster now. I think the internet is changing that dramatically. I don't really think it's going to be another 100 years because it's even speeding it up. But it's one reason for that sort of abrupt change. When you have styles that swing gradually back and forth, that's natural. But when you have change that sort of slams the pendulum to one side, when it slams back, it's going to slam back hard. Bam, the other way, and then bam, back that way. And these extremes, these intense extremes, you go from Stalin to democracy, to Putin. I mean, it's not surprising. That's the history. And it's the same way in China, where you have, you know, the heads of the Communist Party are simply stepped in to the emperor role. And people accepted them immediately as an unquestioned emperor. Why not? There's been 2,000 years of it. So, you know, you got to study history. People who do not study history are doomed to live it again. And it's essential to know why these things are happening. So what is art in Russia? Well, art in Russia is magic. It's mystical. The icon tradition is still dominating imagery in Russia in 1900. These are magical images. They're powerful images. They're sacred images. The spirituality of imagery runs all through Russian art, even when they become cutting edge avant-garde artists, as we will see. And it definitely runs through Kandinsky. He has a very strong sense of that. Abstraction versus naturalism. Abstraction is a term that simply means you're distorting something. Everything we've seen today was abstraction. You know, it's a person, but it's a distorted. You know, it's a street scene, but it's distorted. That's abstraction. Very, very early on, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, abstraction was associated with spirituality. That's why medieval art is abstract. It's distorted. It was seen as more spiritual because the ancient pagans created naturalistic images. Greeks and Roman art is perfect, you know, it's ideal. It looks just right. It's not distorted in any way. Well, those guys were pagans. They're materialistic. They care about what things look like on the outside. That's anti-Christian. That was the medieval sense of view. So medieval art is 1,000 years of abstraction as a way of rejecting paganism, rejecting materialism in favor of the spiritual. So how does that play in the modern world? It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same idea. It's the outer appearance is not reality. It's not truth. It's not what you want. What you want is inner truth, inner reality. And we're going to talk about other ways these ideas are being passed on, and they're being passed on by other modern philosophies. That's where Kandinsky's coming from. When he creates, so this is early, this is really under the influence of the post-impressionists again, but it's really a beautiful piece.
Oh,
I really love this. Very post-impressionist, sort of juicy colors. His colors are always intense. He has, and I don't know if I wrote it down somewhere. Yeah, I did. We'll look at it on the next one. He uses color in this wonderful way. This is, you know, he's looked at Western art. Kandinsky is someone who's Russian, but he's working in Munich, but he travels often to Paris. He knows everything that's happening in Paris. So this is very French, actually. This is very little German style in this. It's purely French. And once you look at enough art, you can see that pretty quickly. This is not German. This doesn't look anything like Kirchner or any of the German expressionists, the sleuths. The one I really want to look at where we really see this sensibility of Kandinsky is in this view of Murnau, which is a small German town where he worked. He's influenced by a couple of different things here. It's a bit, color isn't as good as I have it. It's really much more beautiful on my screen than it is on there. Near Murnau is not far from Munich. It's in the south, and it's not far from Bavaria. And one of the sort of folk art is another primitive art. Another place you can look for primitive is in folk art. And a folk art tradition was called Bavarian glass painting, where they would paint on the back of glass, clear glass, and then you'd like see through it, and the light would like bounce through the glass and give you almost a stained glass quality, right? And he's capturing the light here. He's getting that same almost stained glass like quality. That's coming from both the idea of medieval stained glass, which was also spiritual, and also Bavarian glass painting at the time. So this is where that sort of emotion is coming in, that sort of pure color and intensity of light that you find in sort of mystical images and places. La belle peinture is what you see both in this and the previous work. It's a term we use, it just means beautiful paint, but it's a term we use for French art. It's French, that's why we use the French word, la belle peinture. He's one of the few artists working in Germany that has this quality. It refers to a kind of richness of color, a juiciness of paint, a sort of sensual surface. It's kind of an aesthetic pleasure from paint that is like icing on a cake, it's getting pleasure from that. And it's a very French idea. It's not a German thing at all, but then he's not German, so it's okay. With his Russian sensibility, it appealed more to that. Now, there are some German artists that embrace it, but not very many. This is somewhat similar to the Gauguin in that it's using these sort of pools of color areas and sort of intensities of color. But Gauguin is still not coming from the same place. It's not, but it's not true. Gauguin was interested in spirituality. When we looked at him, we looked at his vision after the sermon that he painted in Pontauban, where he had the French villagers coming out of church and they were having a vision of Jacob wrestling with the angel. It had a cow in the background. Everybody wondered why the cow was there. But also when he went to Tahiti and he did all these paintings about Tahitian myths and belief systems, and he would do paintings that paralleled Christian stories and Tahitian stories. So Gauguin was interested in spirituality. He was very interested in it, as Kandinsky was. But Kandinsky's import is gradually growing, is a philosophical influence, and also innovative, as we'll see. In 1908, he met in Munich Wilhelm Voeringer, and Voeringer is one of these guys that, as art history students, you learn about all these important people who affected art. And Voeringer wrote this text called Abstraction and Empathy. And the one thing they used to rub it in to us, they would remind us that was actually his doctoral dissertation. It became this really important document in art. The idea being you should do something, just as, nobody writes a doctoral dissertation and it ends up being that important. They're usually just things that get thrown on a pile somewhere, and then you go off and hopefully do your good work later. So they were just rubbing it in that this guy made his fame very early and very young. The book, Abstraction and Empathy, was this interesting study where he puts down, really for the first time in writing, this parallel between what was happening at that moment in 1908 and the art of the Middle Ages. He's the first to really draw that parallel, that modern art is like the Middle Ages, and that abstraction happens for a reason. And there's a reason why in the Middle Ages and today, people are turning to the abstract. He says it has to do with the fact that people feel disconnected from the world they live in. If you feel disconnected, you turn to certain forms. It's an interesting idea. It doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong per se. It's the fact that that's how he saw it, and that's how people were seeing it. So he didn't talk about spirituality. You feel disconnected from the materialism of your world. So he saw once the world gets too materialistic, we reject it. And we reject the outer surface of things. And it is true that the 20th century saw revivals in a lot of things. It saw revivals in interest in Asian philosophies and ideas. And we're going to talk about that again, anti-materialist ideals. There are a lot of interesting similarities between the Middle Ages and the modern world, much more so than in the Renaissance. Renaissance has nothing to do with the modern world. That's probably the least important period ever in terms of what is interesting to a modernist. I'm not talking about today, I'm talking about modernism, because we don't live in a modern world today. We live in a postmodern world. So today there is more interest in that intermediary period, but to modernists, we jump over that and we go back to the Middle Ages. That's where all these ideas come from. Withdrawal from materiality. I remind you of Seruzier. We're still pre-World War I. We're still connected to the 19th century. When we looked at Gauguin, we looked at a group of young artists who were, for whom he was the mentor. They accompanied him to Pontauban, this village on the coast, and he pontificated. And then they formed this group called the Nabi. Remember, the symbolist group came out of Gauguin. And one of the most powerful works that affected the 1880s was this small painting by Paul Seruzier called The Talisman. And if you see that painting, total isolation, it could almost be non-objective, but it is a landscape. And when you look at it, knowing that, you can see it. This is water, and those are reflections of sort of the trees and in the water. So it's a landscape, but it had a powerful impact on young artists when he first kind of showed them this. This is the painting that's painted on a cigar box lid. Remember that they would use cigar boxes that they would take out in the field, and a lot of artists painted because they were made of wood, not cardboard, and they were perfect for going out and painting. But it's very similar to that. And Seruzier, as a young symbolist, was really dealing with many of these same issues that Kandinsky was. Now, I put on the handout some quotes from Kandinsky because he was very intelligent and he did write a lot. In fact, we're going to see artists in the 20th century write a lot because they kind of need to in a way. The first thing that came out was the Blue Rider Almanac. That was a series of essays by artists and composers and others involved with the group. And then the Concerning the Spiritual in Art, that is a small book that Kandinsky wrote. It's very small. It's really easy read. I highly recommend it. It's in print. You can find it anywhere. I have a copy somewhere. And in that book, he sets out his ideas rooted in theosophy. But theosophy is, Kendall talks about it once in a while. It's a 19th century idea. It originated, believe it or not, in New York by this expatriate Russian woman, Madame Blavatsky. Theosophy is going strong right now, very strong still. Theosophy, from the name, is a combination of theology and philosophy. And it's a merging of modern Western ideas with a lot of Eastern philosophies, philosophical ideas. And as we're going to see, different artists influenced by theosophy. It was really big in Europe and the early part of through much of the first half of the 20th century. And they're going to take from it different things because it covers many different things. And one thing that Kandinsky, who was a theosophist and a member of the Theosophical Society, one thing he took from it was the idea, very much an Eastern idea again, that the external surface of things is not reality, that the truth of a thing is internal. You have to somehow connect to it, that the outside isn't really truth. And so he's going to take that to heart, and that's going to take him in certain directions. As he says here, the form is the outer expression of the inner content. Necessity creates form. Thus, the spirit of the individual is mirrored in the form. This idea of looking inside, looking beyond the surface, that's very rooted in Buddhism as an idea, but in other Eastern philosophies. Also, he talks in Concerning the Spiritual about the relationship between different art forms. He talks about the vibrancy of color, and he compares that to plucking a string on a violin and how that touches your soul, linking colors and music and sound. And the interest in synesthesia had been around since, the late 19th century. The symbolists were all interested in synesthesia. Synesthesia really refers to sensory experience, but it's about the merging of sensory experience. Synesthesia is the opposite of anesthesia, right? Anesthesia, you have no sensation. Synesthesia, you have all sensations. Now, synesthesia is both an idea, a concept, but it's also a medical condition. And I think I talked about this before. I've only known one person who had synesthesia, but I was fascinated with it. A student of mine had synesthesia, and he told me all about, how he experienced things. Synesthesia is a condition in which something in your brain mixes up your senses, and you can, you can touch a certain texture, and you can maybe hear a sound, or you see a color, and he would hear something, and then he would see a color. And he told me that my voice is yellow. Anytime I spoke, he saw the color yellow. And he would also see shape, like bubbles, round shape. And just hearing him talk about his senses and how they work, I just so desperately wanted to have synesthesia for a day or two, not any longer than that, but I want to experience that.
It sounds like LSD.
It does, but it's not. It's a natural condition. So everything else is perfectly normal other than that. I've heard about people who their sense of touch, they'll hear or taste, or, but so synesthesia, when they talk about synesthesia, they're talking conceptually, not physically. They because he'll use the language of music to talk about his paintings and sounds and the like. And to understand that helps you understand his paintings, to understand he's a musician. Now, this is still an abstract painting. It is not non-objective. Abstract is when you take the natural world and you distort it, but there is still a reference to the natural world. Now, it's almost gone here, but it's not gone. This is a battle scene. This is a scene of, you see hills and buildings. These are riders on horseback, explosions. It's there when you know what to look for, but it's almost gone. But it is still tied to the natural world. Non-objective art is not tied to the natural world at all. It's pure form. And that doesn't exist yet, but it almost exists. He's one of the 5 artists who begin making non-objective art as well. Yeah.
Okay, so abstraction, that is abstraction.
That is abstraction because it's still tied to the natural world. To abstract means to distort something. So by definition, you have to have something recognizable to distort. But non-objective, there is no object. It means it's not based on any object. It's pure form. And we'll talk about that because, he is one of the artists. Now, this is non-objective. And yet it's the same sort of lines and colors and forms. And interestingly, they express the same. They also express chaos and energy and action in the same way that does, but you don't have clues to buildings and hills and riders on horseback. Also, the colors change the meaning, right? This doesn't look battle because of the nice, pretty colors of yellows and pinks. It's more like flowers exploding or something. And it's energy, but it's not the same energy. It's not the destructive energy that you see in the previous. It's what he's trying to do. He's experimenting again. This is, how do I work with pure form, i.e. form not corrupted by materiality, form that's not trying to describe a mountain or a building or an explosion. It's not trying to describe those things. So it's pure, implying that representation is a corrupting force, right? That's kind of the implication. So it's pure color, but how do I speak that language if I'm not defining something? Like if I'm drawing a barn, or I keep going back to barns, or a battle scene or whatever, then I know where lines should be, their outlines. I know where color should be. It should fill in the outline. But if I don't have that narrative or story to tell, then line and color don't play the same role. I don't have to bind color in within an outline. I don't have to do that anymore. So you have line freed from its role with color, color freed from being shaped by line. So it's an experiment. If I do this, how will it work? What will it mean to me? So that's what it is. Yeah.
Is there a conflict there between the two paintings of the audience looking at it and struggling to relate to something,
Absolutely.
and then trying to let go of your mind and feel the emotion?
Yeah, we're right at that point. Remember when we were looking at it, one of the things I talked about in the 19th century a lot was the fact that an audience learns how to read something. They learn how to understand it. When something's new, you don't have a context. Remember, Impressionism was shocking. I don't know how to read this because it's not this context. Realism comes around and it's a painting of guys digging a ditch. How am I supposed to understand this? I have no context for this. This isn't romanticism. I don't know how to read it. So yes, everything that's truly new is difficult because we have no context yet to understand. We have to learn how to read it. And while this still has some context, because I can see a building on the top of a hill, I know that, and I swear to God, that looks like either an egg or an explosion, probably an explosion. I can have some context, but now I have no context. I don't know how to read pure color yet, but it's been a gradual process. We've been learning how to read colors and shapes and lines. It's becoming slowly more and more abstract. So it's not a huge leap. I learned when I looked at Munch's the Scream, I understood those wavy lines suggested this, and this color suggested that. So it's not totally new, but it is a leap to the non-objective because that's a big step to not have a clue given to you. But people will learn very quickly how to read that, and they'll become much more sophisticated with it, as we will see. It is 1912. This isn't like the first or anything. And even some people think even late 1911, about 5 different people at least simultaneously began making non-objective art in totally different places, disconnected from one another. And that really just shows you that there was sort of a path that we were on, and everyone sort of reached that next step at the same time. So there's a logic to why things happen in a certain way. Now, but a year later, I'd also point out the titles to these. Improvisation 28. This black lines, because he's interested in the black lines. Composition 7. These are musical terms. He's relating them to music, and these make a lot more sense. I can't look at that and not hear music. I hear a certain kind of symphony or certain kind of sound. It's joyous. I'm sure he had a very specific thing in his head. He may have even been listening to certain music while he was painting, and that music created these. So he calls it this composition, etc. So absolutely, this is synesthetic. It derives from this synesthesia, this merging of the senses. And it seems very clear to me that that's where it's coming from. This is a harsher symphony. Yeah.
Does synesthesia always involve hearing, or can you?
It just relates to, yeah, absolutely. Any of the senses. It just refers to a belief that on some level, all the senses are connected. That's really what it is. And if you believe they're all connected, then paintings can evoke sounds, and you can feel textures when we know it's true. When you look at certain things that are perfectly smooth and flat, they can evoke the idea of a certain texture. It's why people want to touch paintings. It's why there are guards standing there making sure you don't get too close to a painting, because you have an impulse to touch a certain area, because this texture is tickling a part of your mind, and you want to see with your fingers. See with your fingers. But yeah, that's what it is. And so now there's just more of a conscious play on that. Now, I don't really have time. I did not put Becker on your list. Maybe I won't cover him. No, maybe I will really quickly, because I love Max Beckmann. I love that photo. Max Beckmann was an independent artist in Germany. He wasn't part of any group, and he was by far the most famous. Very early, very precocious. I mean, in his 20s, he had people writing books about him, having major retrospective exhibitions, independent of any groups. And I just adore the man. The small death scene that he painted early, interestingly, it's a German expressionist interpretation as opposed to a symbolist. Munch did the same thing. Munch is referencing suffering, particularly in a way, but it's a totally different feeling from Beckmann's, which is really much more painful, much more aggressive, the impact on those. But they're both focusing on the survivor, not the person that's died. But Munch gives us a very monkish, he always does. He uses these forms that seem to float, and all his works have a certain dreamlike quality to them because of the shapes that he uses, where as a German, Beckmann is just giving us the hard slashing truth with pure, intense color. But I love his self-portraits. These to me are really, I love this self-portrait, sort of biting his lip. This is a German artist, and I love to compare it to Van Gogh's portrait, both showing themselves as artists, but Beckmann is giving us the German interpretation. It's pure passion and intensity. I love the way he's biting his lip. Beckmann is an artist of the post-war period, really. We're rolling over. He starts and makes his career before World War I, but he's going to continue to work just as Matisse does and Kandinsky does, and we'll come back to them. But, he makes Van Gogh look like a very happy together person, compared to, yeah, exactly. And we know he was when he painted this, because he was feeling really, really great. Van Gogh was in a really good place when he painted this. Wouldn't last for long, but it's not the tormented person who we see in some others.
So is Beckmann a tormented?
Yeah, well, he's living in a place that's tormented. Germany, he's living in the Weimar Republic. He's living in hell. And if you don't know anything about the Weimar Republic, go look it up and read it, because I think it's really important right now that everyone understand the Weimar Republic, because we're living it at this moment. It's about the fragility of democracy and how things can fall apart when you look away at any moment. And I highly recommend we look at it. If you've seen the movie Cabaret, you've seen the Weimar Republic. It's a moment after the end of the war. Germany is in hell. Their runaway inflation, the Deutschmark is worth nothing. They're having to take, it's over, I've got it written somewhere, but it's over like 3 billion Deutschmarks to buy a loaf of bread. The money, people walking down the street with wheelbarrows full of bills that have no value. Germany, before World War I, borrowed everything for the war, all their money from the war, banking on a victory. France and the West, they raised taxes and they collected money. Germany lost the war and had not a penny and no way to pay back their debt. And so they started printing money, which is the dumbest thing you can do, because just keep printing money, it just keeps having less and less and less value till it's, so it was like, what the hell? Nobody's got money, it's worth nothing, let's party. The Weimar Republic was ostensibly a republic. They had elected a president, but it was totally corrupt. It was just the most bizarre moment. It was full of violence because fascism was rising early, right after, not long after the war. By the early 20s, there was a lot of violence in the streets. There were a lot of really horrible things happening to people. And this is the world that Beckman is living in. This is one of his most famous works, Die Nacht, the night. It's a bizarre image of the Weimar Republic. It's about violence. Germany was filled with violence, terrorism, civil disobedience. This is really a personification of violence. It's not meant to be a realistic scene. He's using symbolic forms in what he's doing. It's 1919. He's being influenced by other things that we haven't looked at yet. Dada, for some reason, he turns these innocent objects into horrible objects of torture in a way. It's irrational in many ways. It's a bizarre and horrid image of the world he's living in. It's coming from his subconscious. There's no surrealist influence here because it's too early, but there is an influence of a pre-surrealist movement called Dada, which we will talk about. There's certainly influence of that here. He's very much a sponge for the world he's living in. He becomes a kind of social commentary. There's no good guys, no bad guys. It's just horror of the world he's in. One of my favorite self-portraits. This is so 1920s. I can't think of an image that's more 1920s than this very affected, point of view with his hand here. It's so self-conscious. It's just intensely self-conscious. Even the way he bends his fingers and holds the cigarette, it's beautiful. Self-portrait with tuxedo. I can't help but think of this. I think of Albrecht Dürer. If you were with us in the 2020, when I did the Western class, which I'll do again if anyone wants it, the survey of Western art. This is a German Renaissance painting by very famous and also very self-conscious and very self-aware German artist from Nuremberg, Albrecht Dürer, and they remind me of one another. Both of them staring right out at you in a very self-conscious way, both of them trying to make a powerful statement. Dürer is linking himself to Christ. That's very intentional. He's even writing his story on the front of it, telling us how young he was when he painted this. But Dürer is a very famous self-portrait, one of the most famous self-portraits. And I think Beckman deserves the same attention. Yes.
I don't see that as self-conscious.
You don't see the self-consciousness, the pose with his hand here.
Well, I guess it's the look, the look right at you, to me is kind of, he says, so what?
Yeah, that's self-conscious. He's aware of himself being looked at. He's aware of the fact that he's posing for you. He's aware of how you're seeing him.
Okay.
In fact, he's constructing himself to be seen by you. And that's self-conscious. And that's what they're both doing. Both.
Also on the left, I see the Nordic silent language, keep your distance.
Oh, yeah?
That, okay, I'm self-contained and this is my world and don't come into my circle.
Oh, really? That's an interesting take. I hadn't heard that from anybody before, but I do see it. But I didn't
The
think of it in that way.
Northern European
Mhm.
Protestant, keep, this is my private circle and you keep
Yeah.
a certain distance.
Sort of off-putting.
Whereas I don't see it on the right, it's more of the.
No, he wants you to see it. It's much warmer. He wants you to engage and see him. Okay, Beckman, when the war began, went into hiding because he knew the Nazis were looking for him. He actually hid in Amsterdam for several years. And while he was there, he was still working, and he did a number of triptychs, and these are kind of his best known pieces. Triptychs are an important art form because immediately you're reminded of something. They immediately take you to a religious art piece. When we think of triptychs, we think of religious panel paintings like on the front of altars, etc. So it automatically has, just using 3 panels will automatically take it to that level. This is one of his most famous triptychs. It's a very unusual scene. People have tried to read it. It has things in it that Beckman typically has. For one thing, the 2 outer panels, again, have scenes of sort of torture. We don't know what's going on or who's doing what to who or why, but they have figures that are tied up. There are suggestions of horrible things happening, but you don't know what they are. And once again, he's using musical instruments as sort of objects of torture. They both seem to be maybe taking place on some kind of a stage setting. He often uses reversals to create conflict, where you've got one figure upright and one figure the other way. The center panel is sort of the most intriguing. People have suggested that it might depict the Fisher King from the Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which uses this character called the Fisher King. The Wasteland was written in 1922, and it was translated into German in 1927. And we know that he had a copy of it. So that's why some people suggest that refers to the Fisher King. Eliot's Wasteland is really about the decay of the modern world. It's about decay of Western culture. And certainly in 1932, that's what Beckman is witnessing in his world, is the decay of modern culture. He wrote on the back of it, he wrote scenes from Shakespeare's Tempest, but most people believe he wrote that on the back for the Nazis. In case anyone saw the painting, he could argue this is symbolism from Shakespeare, but it really has nothing to do with, there's no Fisher King or anything like this in the Tempest. But he could still argue that. So we don't quite know, it's meant to be vague enough and sort of veiled enough, but it does seem to be about decline and decay and modern culture. When the war ended, he came to the US. This is actually his last self-portrait. He actually went to St. Louis and taught there at Washington University for a while. And if you've ever been to the museum in St. Louis, they have a really good Beckman collection, one of the best in this country, some of his important works, in fact. So if you can ever get to St. Louis, you can really see a number of important works by Beckman there, because he lived there. He taught at the University of Colorado for a year, and then ended up in 1950 in New York, where he was teaching at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and he died at the age of 66 in 1950. So this is his last self-portrait. He died of a heart attack walking through Central Park. So it's an interest. I mean, this man lived through interesting times, it was an interesting period. And I don't think it sounds like a bad way to go, just you're walking through the park and you just die. I think there's something about that always struck me as that's a good way to go.
With the German expressionist painting with the man with one hand cut off.
That's Beckman.
I thought that was.
He does people with limbs cut off. Is that in the Nelson?
Yes.
I gotta go check that.
Yeah, that is in the Nelson.
That probably is a Beckman. I'm gonna go check that out. I haven't been back there in so long. I need to get back there.
We have quite a few of them.
Yeah, he's not really part of the.
Looks like it is, right?
Rose is French.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we're just picking out a couple of things. There are, for all these people we looked at in all these movements, there are hundreds of other people who aren't really part of a particular movement. They're just picking up on all these different things that are happening.
We have a whole movement of expressions.
Have some, yeah. I don't think the 20th century collection is really that good, not compared to what they have of 19th. I mean, every museum has specialties. Every museum has areas where they have a whole lot of really things. And then there's sparse areas. And it's totally dependent on donations. It's totally dependent on what someone in Kansas City was collecting.
Well, they had to pay, they had to buy things for the else, and it was, you know, the artist had been dead for 25 years. So by the time he died,
Yeah.
1975, we'll have the money.
Right. Yeah, Beckman died in 50. Yeah, it's interesting to see how collections get built. We've run over, but that's all I really want to talk about today. Does anyone have any questions before we say goodbye? Any questions about anything we've talked about today or anything?
Very interesting.
Thank you. Next time, we're going to talk about Cubism. And that's really much more complex than most people think and much more influential. Anyway, we'll do that next week.